Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Achieving Rail Decarbonisation webinar hosted by Waterfront Conference Company. Apologies, that's a good start. So my name's Alex Burrows, I'm a director at the Birmingham Centre of Railway Research Education, and I'm moderating this session. We've got a number of speakers lined up for you today, which I'm delighted to see, and I'll be introducing them shortly. Just a reminder, this is currently a bridge really between, we had a conference, a decarbonisation conference scheduled for March of this year, which was unfortunately had to be postponed and will now be taking place on the 10th of September in London. So there's more details available on that, and I'm sure Waterfront will be emailing all of you after this with a reminder to sign up for that conference, and hopefully we can all get to meet in person very soon to discuss this. So a quick summary for today to get us going. So, achieving rail decarbonisation by 2040. I've introduced myself, so I just wanted to say a few words to get us started, and really just to set a context for this. So, we know we've got to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and indeed the government has set that as a legislative target. For the whole country, for the whole economy. And for transport, of course, that's a major focus for us. We are, as a broad sector, the largest emitting sector of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore the focus is going to be on us to address those emissions more broadly over the coming years. I think you all know about the objective for diesel-only trains to be gone from the network by 2040. And indeed, the Department for Transport is at the moment, hopefully, still preparing a transport decarbonisation plan that's due later on this year. Initially, there is a consultation document out at the moment that was published in late March, and I understand that the DFT is sounding out many parties already in terms of what that should be, what that should include in terms of a decarbonisation plan for rail in the near future. If you just bear with me a second, the slides have moved around a touch, so I'll just continue unabated. So I just wanted to say a couple of things actually on from our perspective as a university. Hopefully a number of you know about the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network, of which University of Birmingham is a part. We've been, as a collective of universities, undertaking a lot of research and development activity in the field of sustainable traction systems, in terms of discontinuous electrification, in terms of the opportunities we have to decarbonise the railway in a number of ways. Obviously, electrification is the most efficient way, and I'm sure a number of speakers will be making that point clear. A quick reminder as well, just a small pitch from me, as it's my privilege as the chair's remarks. We've currently planning a number of activities around the field of rail decarbonisation, and one thing we've done is bring together our academics into a centre of excellence for rail decarbonisation that covers a number of broad areas, and I'd certainly be willing to for any questions to come out as a result of this session. Please do feel free to email me to find out more about that, and indeed about an event we're hosting ourselves next week on decarbonisation. The role really of universities, research institutes like ourselves, is to work collaboratively with industry to develop the technologies that are going to support decarbonisation of the railway. And certainly a number of you will have heard about the traction power systems work we're undertaking across the world. Certainly across Europe, we have a large number of projects taking place, predominantly around batteries actually, but I think we're probably known for hydrogen as well. But around smart energy grids, around the infrastructure that supports it, around discontinuous electrification, and around elements like aerodynamics as well, in terms of how can we make trains more efficient to run. So that's enough from me. I'm going to introduce our presenters for today. We've got Andrew Clough from RSSB. We've got Joe O'Donnell from the Rail Freight Group. We've got Jason Brooker from Govia Thameslink Railway. We've got David Clark from Railway Industry Association and Adrian Shooter from Viva Rail. And there will be time for questions. Indeed, you should see a questions box on the right-hand side of your screen, or it may be somewhere else on your screen indeed, but for me it's on the right. Please do ask questions. We'll have time at the end to go through those questions, and I'll pick off as many as possible and get them across to the presenters to provide responses. And if we overrun slightly, to take in some particularly interesting questions, and I'm sure we can cope with that. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker today, Andrew Clough, who is the lead carbon specialist from RSSB. So, Andrew, over to you.
Alex, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to give you a very quick run through the decarbonisation programme that's being undertaken in RSSB on behalf of the Rail Industry Decarbonisation Task Force to date, and I'll say a little bit about what we're going to be doing in the year ahead. So, as Alex has already said, the challenge was kicked off in February of 2018 with Joe Johnson challenging the rail industry to get diesel-only trains off the railway by 2040 and to come up with a vision for decarbonisation. Can we move the slide on? I'm trying to move it and it's not going. Thank you. The task force had representatives from across the industry's major bodies and was operating independently and made 2 reports to the Minister for Rail. The first initial report was in January of last year and the final report was in July of last year. And we've had associated research running alongside. There was one particular project. We work in T projects in RSSB, T1145, which was options for traction energy for the railway, which focused on passenger rail. And we've expanded that with subsequent research projects, and I'll say a little bit about them in a moment. But the task force was initially charged to look at possible decarbonisation activities in 3 key areas: traction, infrastructure and property. And over the course of its work, the year and a half where it was working to produce the final report, it established that governance and delivery aspects would be critically important as a means of ensuring that decarbonisation across those 3 other programme areas was going forward effectively. So effectively a 4th strand has been developed within the work of the decarbonisation task force. The focus areas that were involved were very pragmatic and practical. Clearly there's a split between passenger and freight. What you can do with passenger trains is different from freight because you're operating different duty cycles, different demands. The issue with freight particularly is the need to retain a go anywhere capability and to be able to move very heavy loads under sort of some fairly challenging operational circumstances, working around the priorities for passenger transport in the first place on the railway. There is work ongoing with infrastructure. The task force recommended, based on the advice given from research projects, that in addition to electrification, where that was the only option available, that there should be further studies on technologies likely to be sufficiently mature within the time frame to actually deliver meaningful traction options. So the 2 that evolved from a study of all the options were hydrogen and battery. And alongside the need to develop infrastructure for all those 3 traction areas, we need to be able to get a proper handle on yellow plant and line side power generation, so that appears as the final strand in the infrastructure side. With property stations and depots, the power take in those areas is probably about 10% or so of the total energy demand across the network. One of the things we do need to do is make sure that improvements are built in on a fairly well-regulated basis into either major station and depot refurbishments or into new builds. In the past, guidance on good carbon performance and environmental performance has been advisory as opposed to mandated, and we need to make sure that's built in an appropriate manner. And then, as you can see, making sure that the industry stays coordinated. I'll pick up again on that in a minute, but if you have targets across the industry, but you're not actually managing them on a joined up basis, you'll find that there's a concern that different parts of the industry will head in different directions. We won't achieve what we need to be able to achieve. We know what the long-term targets are, but getting an effective decarbonisation pathway means that we need to look for opportunities for step change improvements within decarbonisation programmes. That's going to be about replacement of vehicles primarily, or the development of significant new infrastructure or changes to existing infrastructure where you can achieve step change improvements, but also aligning that also with progressive incremental improvements through ongoing initiatives across the whole industry. And the final aspect of that is we need to make sure that, although once we've got the targets in place, that we know what we're doing, we know where the sources of carbon are coming from, we know that we're tracking what's happening in policy and target terms, and that we're able to feed back to the industry and to the authorities in terms of progress. So that then leads us into understanding that while we have long-term targets, there's going to be a significant transitional period between now and 2040 at least, and almost certainly up to 2050. And depending on how well we can do various things, such as electrification programs, which I know that David and others will be speaking about later on, it may well extend beyond 2050 in terms of managing transition arrangements as new opportunities for traction improvement pass through the system. Aligned with this are 2 or 3 other key projects. The first one is some work being undertaken by the Network Rail System Operator, and they're picking up on the work of the Decarbonisation Task Force, and also liaising with Department for Transport and other key authorities to try to understand how to develop a map of the GB rail network with recommendations on the preferred forms of traction across the network, based on an economic and carbon appraisal of the effectiveness of different options. Now, essentially, the thinking of the task force initially was that for any high-speed line, that's trains running to 125 miles an hour, so it's essentially the core institute service. If we're trying to decarbonise, and you need to get diesel off the railway, the only viable option in terms of the ability to provide power at the rate that's needed is to electrify. Work coming out of the freight study that I mentioned, which is just in the process of concluding, will be published shortly, has also flagged that if you want to be able to maintain the core of the freight network on a low carbon basis, that it may be important to electrify certain key freight routes, and that will be fed into the TD&S study as well. In addition, we're getting a much better understanding of battery technology, both as a traction mode in its own right, particularly over short hop frequent stop journeys, but also as a range extender or a supplement to other traction modes. Any hydrogen train will have a battery, but it may well be that you've got battery electrics to do last mile or to bridge gaps between electrification areas. You can see on that little map there that the bottom right of the screen has got a lot of green pathways. Those are part of the third rail network, and we're also understanding what we need to be able to do with the third rail network within a low carbon future, and what additions and amendments we might need to make to that. So that's all being developed within the TD&S. But at the end of it all, we'll be supplementing the work that's been done already, and expanding on it quite significantly to produce a whole life model for both cost, benefit and carbon on the network. Alex also mentioned the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. The consultation document came out just a month or so ago, and you'll see with that there are the 6 strategic priorities. One of them is modal shift to public transport, but the other one, which is interesting in there, is decarbonisation of road vehicles. And the key point about this is that although rail is a low carbon option, given the rate at which road transport may be able to decarbonise, it won't necessarily retain its natural advantage in carbon terms if it doesn't make significant proactive steps, as it's already doing now, to decarbonise further. But there's going to be a balancing act between how quickly can you decarbonise, how expensive is it going to be, and what is the sort of different other transport modes doing in terms of maintaining rail's natural advantage and also encouraging the modal shift to public transport. There are concerns, of course, being expressed as a result of the lockdown as to how well public transport can be used in the near term at least, but that doesn't necessarily change the sort of medium to longer term outlook for rail as a low carbon form of transport once we're able to relieve all restrictions. One thing that we've not looked at in particular within the immediate work of the task force over the last year and a half, because it was focusing on what the rail industry can do, is carbon in the supply chain. But we are going to be expanding our focus in the next round of research projects to look at how it can influence supply chains as well. The core programme for 2019-20, I've just sort of flagged up those projects in the middle: carbon footprint, traction options, targets and incentivisation. So I said a little bit about those already. We have had other projects ongoing as well. So looking at passenger traction options. We're looking at freight traction options, which is just concluding. We've also looked at what may be required to bring hydrogen and battery trains into service in a safe and sufficient manner to allow those to be deployed across the network on a standard basis, complying with safety requirements, but also to enable them to be operated pretty well anywhere across the network without any sort of interface challenges with infrastructure. So the hydrogen-powered trains has just completed, and 1195, the battery-powered trains route and services, is ongoing. And I mentioned also that we're doing some work on the third rail network, and that project will be launching fairly soon, I would think. You can see here as well, what we've done is sort of flag up where we feel that knowledge requirements are necessary within the industry. One of the other challenges for decarbonisation is that there aren't that many people within the industry who have an intimate knowledge of the railway, but also an intimate knowledge of carbon. And we're focusing on areas and opportunities to expand the skill set and knowledge base of the industry, so that as the imperative for decarbonisation increases, the people are available and skilled to be able to carry that through across the industry. So I'm trying to move the slide and it's not moving it. There we go. What we have got from all of these is a very clear series of messages about what the challenges are that we're facing in the industry, and also a series of questions that we need to address in the year ahead. The text is looking a bit small just on my sort of compacted picture I'm getting on my screen, but essentially what we do know is that the future traction map is going to be based around an expanded spine of electrification, with hydrogen battery traction options being deployed in areas across the country where they work to the strengths of those traction options. Battery is very good for certain types of services, so right, short run, frequent stop. Hydrogen has better range and speed over extended distances, but it doesn't have the same acceleration capabilities as batteries, and we have to sort of marry them all together and make them work in an effective manner. We do have challenges with freight, and one of the questions that we need to carry on asking is whether or not, within the scope of the targets that are being set out for the rail industry, whether or not there may be a requirement for some form of ongoing thermal combustion using internal combustion engines, or whether that should be regarded on a transitional basis only. Within the footprinting, we need to make sure that the footprint properly addresses those sources of carbon within the industry, and that the guiding hands who are responsible for managing carbon are properly identified, so that targeting can be done in the most effective way, and that the KPIs that are put in place recognise where carbon is sourced in the industry, and also how best to manage it in terms of the incentives and mechanisms and tools that are in place. Within the infrastructure side, it's still not clear who may be managing infrastructure where it's not electrification. Network Rail does the electrification aspect at the moment, we know, and it may well be that they end up with the management of hydrogen and battery networks, but because we don't yet understand how those infrastructures will be implemented, I don't think it's yet clear how that can be done, and that would be the subject for further discussion, I guess, within Network Rail and DFT over the next 12 to 24 months. A lot of the decisions we need to make for 2040 will have to be done over the next 12 to 24 months to allow sufficient time for confidence to build with industry that there is a clear mandate for alternative traction options, and that we know how they're going to develop across the network, and therefore that design can be done on a cost-effective basis for both the infrastructure and for the rolling stock themselves. And then finally, on the right-hand side of that, with the targeting and incentivisation, the transport DFT are very clear that they will be setting the long-term targets within the decarbonisation plan that Alex mentioned. It will be in line with national targets, but that we need to help them to be best informed on the right pathways and the right interim targets to achieve that long-term target on the most cost-effective basis. So part of that is going to be saying, we've got the incremental targets, but also asking the question about how fast and who needs to be taking those actions. So I think that covers off everything I needed to say on that. I've just finished my 10 minutes, and so I'll hand back to Alex.
That's great. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I think what I'm really pleased to see is the intellectual basis and rigor for the whole discussion and plan for rail decarbonisation in particular is certainly being undertaken thoroughly. And I'd also point out, actually, interestingly, that rail's only 1.4% of transport greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, which is a very small number given the volume of traffic, the volume of people we move and freight we move, indeed. And talking of freight, it's now time for Joe O'Donnell, Head of Policy at the Rail Freight Group. Joe, if you'd like to open camera yourself, please. So Joe, I see you joined in January 2020, having worked in policy roles in other sectors, but your interest in sustainability issues drew you to rail freight, which is excellent, and you are very welcome today to join us to talk about rail freight, which is an important area to discuss in the decarbonisation theme. So if I can hand over to you now to take us through this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. As you said, yes, decarbonisation and creating a more sustainable world is one of the things that attracted me to working at the RFG. So it's great for me that there's a lot of work going on about decarbonisation at the moment. But on reflection so far, my main impression is that dealing with decarbonisation is rather fragmented, and I think that's a bad thing for rail freight. So what do I mean by that? I think rightly, the transport sector is looking very hard at how it can decarbonise, given that it is, as already been mentioned, now the highest emitting sector. And as a result of that, again, rightly, there's a lot of focus on how each aspect of transport can reach net zero. But I think that risks missing the big picture. Rail freight is already the best way to decarbonise freight on land over long distances. It emits about 25% of the gases with global warming potential of road freight for the equivalent journey. And in 2017, rail freight removed 8.2 million equivalent road journeys. Reducing road congestion by reducing the number of HGVs on the road is also likely to reduce traffic emissions, although I haven't yet started to consider how this benefit of rail freight might be calculated. So given that there is this huge 75% carbon emissions saving to be made roughly today, even with diesel locomotives, it seems obvious to me that this should be a central plank of any plan to decarbonise transport of goods. The coronavirus has already seen rail freight step up and be running longer trains in places, showing its potential. I think it's worth remembering that the emissions data suggests that a 10% modal shift of HGV traffic to rail could reduce overall national emissions by as much as the rail industry's annual contribution. I think this statistic should be at the forefront of our minds when we think about how to achieve decarbonisation. So as already been mentioned, the main piece of work going on at the moment, and one of them is on decarbonising the railways, is the Traction Decarbonisation Network Study. As the name suggests, this is designed to look at traction decarbonisation and not decarbonisation of transport or rail as a whole. Therefore, it doesn't really address modal shift's ability to decarbonise transport now. Now, that wouldn't matter so much if there was a clear indication that modal shift would be dealt with in a strategic plan. But the recently published Decarbonising Transport Setting the Challenge, which is trying to shape what's going to appear in the 2020 Transport Decarbonisation Plan, is looking a bit disappointing on this. I think that the Transport Decarbonisation Plan should be the document which pulls all the separate strands of work being done on decarbonisation together and thinks about it in the round. Now, I appreciate that the document is a start of a process to arrive at the final text of the plan, and it does make multiple positive statements about the environmental credentials of rail and rail freight. However, from my perspective, there's two big issues with it. Firstly, rail freight isn't mentioned within any of the strategic priorities identified for the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. I think this risks rail freight's proven role in decarbonisation not being fully exploited. So to avoid this, in our response, we urge the government to insert rail freight in the movement of goods strategic priority. We also suggest that rail freight is represented on the new Net Zero Transport Council. Secondly, it's also disappointing that there's no indication that the government will state what level of modal shift it wants to see from road to rail and water. The EU's Green Deal states that, as a matter of priority, a substantial part of the 75% of inland freight carried today by road should shift onto rail and inland waterways. The UK government should, as a minimum, set the same goal. But to be seen as truly world leading on decarbonisation, it should set a target for the amount of freight it would like to see on rail. England's already fallen behind Scotland in this respect, where there's a rail freight growth target. To be fair, the government's plans to publish a new cross-modal freight strategy later this year to, in its words, reflect the sector's contribution and the important role freight plays in achieving the government's wider policy goals. And hopefully this document may go some way to addressing the points I've raised. But to ensure rail freight's contribution to decarbonisation is maximised, I think it's really important that either the cross-modal freight strategy or the transport decarbonisation plan set out a target for modal shift and include it within a transport decarbonisation plan strategic priority. It's also really important that huge projects like HS2 support modal shift by making sure that the space they free up on the rail network and it includes space for more rail freight. I was very pleased to see this morning an email that the RFG will be meeting with Andrew Stevenson, Minister for HS2, virtually next month to discuss the impact of HS2, NPR, etc. on rail freight capacity. So hopefully we might have some good news there. So although this webinar is about decarbonising rail by 2040, I've talked a lot about the wider role of freight in decarbonisation. That's because I think it is quite easy to lose sight of the fact that a 10% freight modal shift could reduce emissions by the entire rail industry's annual contribution. And I think driving that point home when we think about this is really important. And also, I thought Andrew would talk a lot about the T1160 project on decarbonisation and air quality improvement in the rail freight industry. But as has already been mentioned, rail freight is clearly more difficult to decarbonise than passenger trains. This is due to the level of energy density needed to power the trains carrying heavy aggregates, etc., and other issues. So as a result, the solution for decarbonisation is mostly going to be electrification at present, due to these technological and commercial issues. For example, giving over more wagon space to battery or hydrogen or gas can make the freight train uneconomical to run. So T1160, as Andrew said, has been looking at all these details in detail, or these issues in detail rather, and that's going to be reporting quite soon. So I think what's likely is we're the first going to see more diesel electric hybrids to maintain rail freight's ability to go anywhere on the network. This will also allow rail freight to become increasingly decarbonised as hopefully electrification of the network progresses. It also gives time for other technologies to be refined and developed as time goes on, because it's important that whatever options are pursued to decarbonise freight, the costs of that, whether it's the investment costs or the space taken up, don't mean that rail freight becomes uncompetitive when compared to road, and we see modal shift back onto road, causing a significant carbon emission increase. So what steps are needed now? I think a good first step would be for the government to commit to a number of infill schemes that we and others have suggested, which will open up longer electrified freight routes. This will also help establish confidence within the rail freight sector to make the kind of investment, the substantial investment that's going to be needed in hybrid locos. We then need to see a commitment as soon as possible to a rolling program of electrification, sooner rather than later if sufficient progress has been made by 2040. The government should also start examining how it should be using other levers, such as how the Treasury values carbon reduction when making decisions on investments. And although traction is obviously a major source of carbon emission, one of the pieces of work we're starting to think about now, the rail freight group, is decarbonisation in the wider sense. We want to encourage the rail freight sector to think holistically about reducing carbon emissions in depots, warehousing, supply chains, etc., so that rail freight can position itself as clearly the most sustainable option. So, in conclusion, while there is scope for significant decarbonisation of rail freight by 2040, I think it's unlikely we'll see it totally decarbonised by then. unless there's a huge and fast program of investment announced very soon. But I think the important message that I want to take away from this is that the mode of shift is vital to decarbonising now without waiting for new technology and huge amounts of investment. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was excellent. Well done. And I like the point around the holistic view as well for rail freight. While I've got you, just to highlight, everyone, if you could please do send questions in, but we've had a question specifically for Joe, which I'll tell you now, and which if you could hold on to it and have a think for when we get to Q&A later on. It's a great question on the opportunity for new technologies, specifically focused on decarbonising rail freight. Which is obviously of particular interest, has caught my eye, but is an interesting thing because quite often we see all the focus on technology is focusing on passengers, passenger rail and passenger experience specifically. So I'd be quite interested to bring that in later on. Okay. Brilliant. Right, the next speaker is Jason Brooker, who's Head of Environment at Govia Thameslink Railway. I'm particularly pleased to see that Jason is currently undertaking an MSc in Climate Change Policy and Development. Less pleased it's at the University of Sussex rather than Birmingham, but that's forgiven given the way you're working. I won't go on with the whole introduction, actually. I'll let you talk and tell us about what you're up to at the moment. Thank you, Jason Brooker.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alex. And good morning, everybody. I hope you're all keeping well and safe, considering the struggles we're going through at the moment. So decarbonisation from the train operator perspective is quite an interesting one. We don't have the wider sort of influence that perhaps other areas of rail have. However, there are certain areas that we need to look at specifically. There are areas that we can contribute quite intently on, and there are areas that really need to be looked at in order for us to actually make some real big differences here. The first thing I want to talk to you about this morning is around the franchising. Franchising lengths for train operators at the moment between sort of 7 to 9 years of extensions as and when it's not long enough. It's not long enough. We cannot be a sustainable operating company living on these timescales that don't allow us to have significant projects. So whilst there are bits and pieces happening here and there, project length doesn't allow itself due to the payback period within the franchise systems. Now, I'm very aware that we've got the Williams review is going to be coming out this year, and that's going to see significant change to how franchising works. But with that, one of the areas that really needs to be looked at is how this longevity of projects feeds in throughout franchising throughout the next 20 to 30 years. If we want to look at decarbonising by 2040, 2050, then actually we need to be looking at long-term projects throughout different franchises, how that feeds into for us, for instance, in GTR at the moment, if we have a committed obligation at the moment to achieve XYZ, how that then feeds into the next franchise and the franchise after to make this long-term project, this long-term thinking, which is an area that isn't quite there yet. Also within the franchising itself, if the industry is very much committed to decarbonisation, then there needs to be more within the franchise committed obligation side of things in order to actually strengthen that. At the moment, yes, we have sustainability, environmental related commitments, but actually they need to filter through the business to be for organisations to be looking at that higher strategic level. At the moment, the focus is, of course, on safely moving our passengers. Actually, we need to be putting environmental improvements, decarbonisation up there as well, and be getting that top level commitment and buy-in. We're very fortunate in GTR. We do have a lot of very strong support from our top management team around environmental issues, around climate change adaptation, mitigation. We are very fortunate. We only have a couple of years left in our franchise. How this is going to look going into the next one is very difficult to tell. But again, like we said, Williams review, that might change things. So it's going to be interesting to see how that looks. There's also the question of what does decarbonisation actually mean to train operators? The way that we procure our energy, when we talk about decarbonising rail, we're looking at electrification, potential of hydrogen, other mode of operations for our trains. But actually, how's that energy procured? Where's that traction? If we're electrifying our lines, where's that energy coming from to power those trains? Something that needs to be considered. And there's interesting, Andrew did mention it on his slide at the beginning around non-traction, because this is an area where train operators can have a bit of influence. For us in GTR, non-traction energy only actually accounts for 6% of our total energy consumption. But that 6% is across around 260 odd stations. And it's about 50.5 million kilowatt hours. So whilst it's only 6% of total energy, it's still a significant amount. There are opportunities where we can bring in green electricity tariffs. Yes, absolutely. But actually, what scope is there to encourage renewables on our stations? And again, this comes back to the point around the franchising and these long length projects. Actually, if we could introduce solar on stations, then there's more opportunity for us. But at the moment, we can't do that as much because of these long timescales and these long feedback areas. And also, how does that feed into wider operations within the train operators? How do we decarbonize our embedded carbon? So procurement, for instance, the projects that we do, how do we deal with the carbon emitted through managing our waste? Land management, there's a huge amount of land in rail. Actually, where's the opportunity? And that's where I think we really need to get to a point where we're just taking these opportunities, improving this franchising system, and sort of taking the opportunities that are already there, because that's the thing, a lot of this is already here. There's opportunities to do these things. The problem is that there's not enough joined up thinking at the moment in order for us as a train operator to do it. All the time we live in, again, coming back to this 7-year, 9-year lifespan, it becomes incredibly difficult to put some of these long-lived projects in place. And I think there's a lot of want to do it. Again, top management have a lot of interest in this. They really want to push it through. We're looking at projects to install community solar on some of our depots, working with Energy Garden. There's opportunity there. These things are there, but it's about finding the right way that we can actually do it and in order to drive this forward. And that's the big challenge for us at the moment. This commitment to decarbonisation within train operators, we really need to lift this up a little bit more, I think. It's a real challenge. It's a real challenge as a train operator. We do a lot of feeding in work with the likes of RSSB through Rail Environment Forum, through the Climate Change Adaptation Work Group, and also we've got a lot of work that we do at Go Ahead Group level, or our owning group, through our Climate Change Task Force. And this is really good, and this is making a lot of difference. But again, we need to join up. So not just joining up with the train operators, joining up with our owning groups as well, because there's a lot of shared experience. There's a lot of good experience out there. And I think we just need to capture it a little bit more. We haven't got enough time to carry on with all the discussion of how we're going to do. We need to start acting now a little bit more. We need to start being a bit more proactive, I think. I think a lot of that is happening, and as other speakers have said, and I'm sure others will as well, and we all know the rail industry doesn't move necessarily that quickly. But that being said, there are still things that we need to do, and there are still things that we need to start acting now on. Rolling stock, I'd be interested to sort of hear about from the rolling stock manufacturers. I'm no expert in rolling stock, I'll be quite honest, but any changes that needs to happen to rolling stock in order to make them more efficient, again, that needs to be happening now, because we've just replaced our old rolling stock with our Class 700s. We've got about 16% better efficiency out of them, and our regenerative capacity has increased massively. These are replacing rolling stock from 20, 30 years old. So if we're going to be putting new rolling stock in now, again, that's something we need to be considering. And it is very encouraging to know that, looking through the RSSB's decarbonisation task force group, the work that's been going into that is incredibly encouraging. It's just trying to figure out where the train operators can fit into that in order to develop the most impact, really. So yeah, to sort of summarise been saying, franchising, absolutely huge thing for us. It's a massive driver as well as a barrier. There's a lot that needs to be, I think, reviewed within franchising around decarbonisation, around wider environment, and around wider sustainability and social value. There's a lot that can go into that. And also, again, what does this mean to us as train operators? Decarbonisation. What can we influence? Our procurement lines, our projects, our waste management. Where are those opportunities? Yeah, so I'll be on the panel a bit later. So any questions around train operating, please, by all accounts, give me a shout. And Alex, I'll hand back over to you. And that's my 10 minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jason. That was really interesting. And again, you mentioned around the importance of taking that holistic view, which I think is really important. What I might also be interested to hear about later on is around, I suppose, the role of incentives and motivation, and perhaps carrot versus stick in terms of how can we drive that change. So thank you very much. Jason. So next person up is, we all know David Clark, Technical Director of the Rail Industry Association, Chartered Engineer, Fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, trained at BR. A great history, David, and many of us know you. So I'm going to stop talking and let you tell us more about what you're up to at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. Hopefully, right. Okay, oops, pressing too fast. I've titled my slides as Achieving Rail Decarbonisation by 2050, rather than the title of the seminar, which is 2040. And I'll give some reasons why in a moment. This is a slide that Andrew might have used, which is something that the Decarbonisation Task Force pulled together, and it's trying to summarise a possible decarbonisation strategy. So time is on the x-axis and size of the network is on the y-axis. And what it's trying to explain is that in 2020, we have roughly about 40% of the network electrified. That's the green bit at the top. And you would imagine, and we think that the Traction Decarbonisation Network study is going to evidence this, that the proportion of electrification is going to need to increase significantly in order to achieve decarbonisation. So might double, might go to 70, might go to 80% of the network. And that's needed for the intensively used parts of the network. For the less intensively used parts of the network, there's a role for zero carbon self-powered traction, which might be battery, might be hydrogen, and we can see that growing over time. There's a question, of course, in the middle about there's a sort of grey area in the middle, and that's where currently things like bimodes exist and the current fleet of diesels exist, but they, as this diagram seeks to illustrate, will need to be squeezed out over time. And obviously, as has been highlighted by Joe, that's a particular challenge for freight. So the question is whether that grey bar that grey wedge comes down to zero. So what we're basically saying is we would expect a lot more electrification in order to be able to decarbonise. But electrification is expensive, isn't it? Certainly the government thinks so. And to be fair, they've got some justification for thinking that. Oops, not allowing for the time lag. Some of you may have seen this graph before. This comes from RIA's Electrification Cost Challenge. And it analyses 20 projects that occurred over the CP5 timeframe, some in Europe, but most in the UK. And what it shows in that block in on the right-hand side is that actually 2/3 of the projects were delivered within what we would describe as the efficient cost range, which is below 1.5 million per single track kilometre. As you can see, Scotland has actually been quite good at delivering within that range. So is Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland. The projects, the 25% of projects on the left-hand side are the ones that were delivered much above that range and gave the industry a bad reputation. And they're things like Great Western, for example. Now, clearly, Great Western was a problem. It was a project that went badly wrong and cost something like 3 times as much as it should. But there's been a huge amount of lessons learned, and those are now being applied. So the latter phases of both Great Western and Midland Main Line are being delivered within that cost range. So the fundamental point here is that the industry has learned lessons and can deliver, and already is delivering efficiently. So we don't have to sort of cross our fingers and promise to implement a load of improvement initiatives before we can deliver efficiently. 75% of the projects over recent years were delivered efficiently. But we can do even better, I believe. The red bars on this graph, again, this is something that's probably been seen quite a lot before. The red bars on this graph are the historic volume in single track kilometres of UK electrification. And as you can see, you have what RIA calls a boom and bust cycle. So after West Coast, it tailed off a bit, East Coast, a bit of a boom, and then a very long bust for almost 20 years before the CP5 program came in. That little wavy line across the middle, this yellowy mustard colored line, is Germany. That is how many kilometers Germany has been electrifying over the last 50 years. A fairly steady 200 kilometers a year, every year, come rain or shine. Guess who is more efficient and cost effective at delivering electrification? You can refer back to the previous chart, which shows that actually Germany is at the lower cost end of the spectrum. But the recommendation we made here about a 10-year rolling program was back in 2019, before a lot of the decarbonisation agenda had really become prominent, and we were recommending it in the context of electrification is the most efficient way to run a railway. But actually, as we all know, there's a much wider context already, putting aside it's mentioned on this slide, putting aside Joe Johnson's challenge to have no diesel-only trains by 2040. What the UK law says is net zero carbon by 2050. That's why I've chosen that as the end point. But we'll see also here on this slide that Scotland is more ambitious. They want to achieve zero carbon rail by 2035, which is clearly an ambitious agenda. So how feasible is that? Well, if we go back to a version of the graph I was showing before, the red bars again are the UK volume over the years. The line on this is the moving 5-year moving annual average. Now, in order to deliver the kind of volume of electrification that we are thinking that the Traction Decarbonisation Network study is going to talk about when it's published in July, we would need to deliver about 10,000 kilometres over 25 years if we don't start until the beginning of CP7 in 2025. And as you can see, that's almost as much as we've ever done before. And what's a bit careless, actually, is that where we are now, existing projects are running to an end, teams are being disbanded, and then we're going to want them all back again at the beginning of CP7. So our big plea is that as RIA is that we need to start now. We need to start now with the electrification. We need to keep the teams in business and ramp up towards that high level in CP7 running out to 2050. We also need to immediately progress fleet orders of low carbon rolling stock. I mean, there's a lot of demonstrable capability out in the industry. We see fleet orders in Europe. There's no reason why we need more prototypes and more experiments. We need to get on with fleet orders. But the reason I say 2050 perhaps rather than 2040 is we need to pace ourselves, because if we were to say 2040, this is what that graph would look like. And that would be what you might call a boom, and it's certainly followed by a bust, because once you've electrified everything you need to electrify to decarbonize, then there's not much more work beyond that. So we have to start now, but we need to pace ourselves. So at that point, I'll hand back to Alex.
Thank you, David. And that's really interesting. And I think when you see the data, and certainly the hyperactivity versus hiatus, then it is a telling situation and one that needs to be addressed. Okay, without further ado, I shall pass on to Adrian Shooter, who I think hopefully we all know, the CEO of Viva Rail, with 40 years of experience in the rail industry. I know that Viva Rail has been doing some very interesting things, and I look forward to hearing more about them right now. So, Adrian, over to you, please.
Thank you, Alex. Alex, can you move my slides on, please, because I haven't got a control for them. Thank you. Right, I set Viva Rail up about 5 years ago. Hold it there, please. About 5 years ago, because after a long time in the rail industry, I felt, as one of the previous speakers has said, that progress is slow, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So what have we been doing? We've been developing over that 5 years the technology for battery trains. What you see here in this picture is one of our test trains, which spent most of the second half of last year running out on the Cotswold line between Oxford and Worcester to refine and demonstrate its performance. Next, please. Each of the battery driving motor cars, which are the end ones, have 2 battery modules weighing about 1.5 tons each. Now, the picture that you see here is the type that we've been using for the last couple of years. Next, please. Which can be slid into the train and then removed from the train by a forklift truck. Now, it's worth noting that we've designed this system, which is patented as well, so that it not only fits under the trains that we're building, where we're reusing the excellent body shells of some London Underground trains, which have a major advantage of being quite light in weight, which means, of course, distance is rather more achievable. But in the last 2 years, we've been working with another battery company, and we now have a replacement battery for this that fits in exactly the same place, but which has got some very much improved characteristics. Next, please. A year or so ago, we launched our first pure battery train in Scotland, as it happens. This train is capable of going 80 miles between charges, and doing that on a regular basis, by the way. And with the new battery, we can recharge in 10 minutes. That's 80 miles worth of energy back in 10 minutes. Of course, if it's on a short branch line, only going, say, 10 miles or so, the charging time is proportionately less. Next, please. So, as I mentioned, we've been spending 6 months last year testing out on Network Rail's Cotswold line. Now, this particular train is a 3-car train. The 2 end cars are what we call battery driving motor cars. They do exactly what they say on the tin. Now, this one, the middle car, has got diesel gensets under it. So this is a diesel battery hybrid. And this is a prototype and a test train for the 5 trains that we're just about to start delivering for the Welsh Government. Now, the advantage that these trains have over conventional diesel ones is, firstly, like all battery trains, their acceleration is very much more significant than diesel trains. In fact, a battery train can accelerate at roughly twice the rate of many DMUs, which is quite important if you're starting to look at reducing journey times, making rail more competitive. Secondly, of course, you can recover some of the braking energy back into the batteries, and that typically will reduce the fuel consumption on a train like this by about 25%. Next, please. This is a picture of the new battery module that we've been developing with this company for 2 years. We've taken delivery of the first ones and are just about to fit them. The technology that's used here enables us to get this 10-minute charge time, which does entail high currents, but nevertheless, we've designed and patented a charging system, which comes up in a minute. Next, please. This really shows 3 types of trains that we're contemplating. In each case, the end cars are identical to the ones we're building for the Welsh Government. They're battery driving motor cars. The top one, a pure battery train, we're building one like that at the moment, which will be running certainly in the first quarter of next year, a little delayed because of COVID-19. That battery train will go 100 miles between charging and would therefore be capable of replacing a lot of DMUs in a lot of places. We'll be demonstrating that around the country this time next year in quite a number of routes. The middle one, thank you, the middle one, which we're also building at the same time, is 25 kV battery one. So in this case, unlike the Welsh trains, which as I explained have diesel gensets on the middle car, this one has a pantograph and transformer. Now the range of this train will be approximately 80 miles off the wire. In other words, it can run under the 25 kV wire or equally well on the third rail, if we configured it that way, and then carry on for up to 80 miles before going under the wire again. Now, of course, this sort of train means that the debate about David's proposals about the amount of electrification that's needed could be tempered a bit by this. I totally agree with him that more mainline electrification is required, particularly in order to enable more freight trains to be electrically hauled, also for higher speed passenger trains. But don't think that battery trains are necessarily low speed ones. We're talking to a number of customers at the moment about repowering existing trains, which would have a 75 or possibly 90 mile an hour capability on batteries. The bottom train on this picture is a hydrogen fuel cell train, which we are not currently building, except the 2 end cars are totally standard. We'll come to that in a moment. Next, please. The fast charge device, which I mentioned, basically is a container with a lot of batteries and a fair bit of technology, which charges up from the mains. The contact system and the arrangements between that and the train are patented. And this system is currently very well on through the Network Rail product approval process, with a view later this year to this becoming the standard Network Rail approved charging system for anybody's battery trains, not just Viva Rail's, anyone else's. Next, please. Hydrogen fuel cell train. Yes, we've contemplated building one. The middle car in this case will have fuel cells and hydrogen storage. However, there are some challenges with this. People have spoken about the need to have a hydrogen fuel network, which is absolutely right. Also, an inconvenient fact is that for any given amount of energy, hydrogen requires 9 times the volume of diesel fuel. Now that's given rise to various suggestions that some of that hydrogen needs to be put in the upstairs bit. I'm a bit old-fashioned. I think the upstairs bit is for the passengers. Next, please. Another issue which is worth looking at, and we've come up with this very carefully. At the top, we're looking at the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity, and the figure we've quoted there, you can have whatever figure you like, but the figure there is off the website. It's a Network Rail standard charge. We're assuming that electricity is used either to power a battery train or to power the hydrogen fuel cell train. Now, I am aware that other sorts of hydrogen are possible, but this is pure hydrogen produced by electrolysis. And if you look down the table, the net result is that the fuel cost of a hydrogen fuel cell train is more than 3 times as much as either a battery train or a pure EMU. And that's a calculation which you don't hear much about and needs to be factored into consideration. These figures, by the way, are conservative. In other words, it may well be that the hydrogen cost is quite a bit higher. And when you then factor it on a cost per seat mile basis, which is all really train operators and government are interested in, if you're putting some of the hydrogen upstairs, then the disparity is even greater. Next, please. So I mentioned these trains for Wales. Here is the first one actually out on test on the Cotswold line. Next, please. The interior can be done in all sorts of different ways. This particular one has high back seats, luggage racks, air conditioning. There can be metro variants as well. Next, please. And there's a lot of work going on. We're talking to a number of people overseas, the fast charge system I've mentioned, and the technology that we have is eminently transferable either for retractioning existing trains or for installing into brand new ones. So thank you very much for listening. Happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Adrian. That was really interesting. Now, I'm aware we've had a number of questions come in, but that time has been somewhat squeezed. So I'm going to ask first Joe to come back and then Jason on a couple of questions that I've forwarded on to them. So Joe, first of all, I think you've got 3 questions to come through. There was the one on technology. There was one on the the respective balance between focusing on modal shift versus focusing on decarbonising highways. And then there was a final question on how do you get that last mile element sorted. So can I ask you to address those for us?
Yeah, so dealing first with technology, obviously there is lots of potential for new technology and work to be going on. We recently supported a first of a kind application for looking at how hydrogen could be used in relation to freight and how that hydrogen might be compressed more to use less wagon space. But one of the things that I've been thinking about as well is when looking at research, I think it's a real opportunity to make sure that all research does look at how it can be applied across different modes. I think that's not just in rail. I think it's probably a lot of lessons to be learned across transport. And so I think it's important to make sure that when that research is being funded, that kind of interoperability is considered and how those messages are disseminated back to industry. And so we also, so I'd be very interested to hear when anybody is doing that kind of research and trying to share that with our members and help kind of broker partnerships to help develop that. There is some interesting work that Tarmac and the University of Derby are doing, and so I think that's hopefully going to get some funding. That's going to look amongst other things at kind of building a freight train of the future. Going back to what I said earlier about the EU's Green Deal kind of prioritising modal shift, I think that is going to have quite some interesting impacts on kind of European research direction, because if they are focusing on modal shift, I think that's going to see interesting research done on how that's going to be achieved. So that kind of brings me also back to the kind of, well, why look at modal shift rather than go for roads? And I would say, well, first of all, I don't think it's either or. I think we have to be working on all these areas concurrently. But as I pointed out in my talk, I think there is already, yes, decarbonising road transport is a big win, but there's also already a big win by trying to achieve modal shift now as things stand, that 76% reduction roughly. But there's also important to think there's other challenges for roads. So from my understanding, they're experiencing a driver shortage. There's obviously other issue. I believe that there's no real clear solution currently for HGV. So I think what we really want to look at in an ideal world, and I think this is something that the decarbonisation plan and other issues should be looking at, is how the sectors work together best. So whether that's encouraging and driving increased use of rail, and then having the final mile with lighter kind of delivery vans, which are less of a challenge to use battery, etc. And going back then to the kind of hybrid point, I think, yes, ideally, you'd want to be you would want to be kind of commissioning hybrid, which still uses diesel. But I think that's where we are at the moment with the technology to enable us to go anywhere. Because if we're looking at a kind of electric battery hybrid, that has implications around the kind of capacity to store battery power in addition on the freight train. So I mean, these are things which might be addressed as the technology develops, but it's not quite there yet. So in terms of final mile for freight, I think there's developments around looking at battery powered shunters, which stuff like, and things like that to try and address that issue there. So hopefully those answers to those questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'd like to bring Jason in back in next on a couple of questions we've had. One is on the value that passengers place on demonstrable efforts to decarbonise by operators, and the other, the question that, and we mentioned it, around actually assessing the whole life cycle cost and value of applying sustainability and decarbonisation into infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay. So to say the first question first, I think there is. I think our customers do value our green credentials. I mean, you only have to look at other areas of society at the moment to see how environment is now growing on the agenda. When I first started doing this, I joined the rail about 10 years ago. I was working in the ticket office as an environment champion. I was a volunteer doing this. You wouldn't hear anything about environment. It would be very rarely on the news. There'd be a couple of stories here and there. Now, every single day, there's something around the environment, around climate change, is in the media. People are talking about it all the time. You see a lot of other organisations. People are absolutely more caring about this than perhaps they've ever been. It's almost like this is it's the time for the environmental professional. It's never been this high up in the agenda. So actually, I think very much so that not only do our customers and our passengers appreciate it, but actually there's an expectation on organisations now, and I don't think this is limited to rail. I think this is wider. There's an expectation that that we have these green credentials, that we are seen to be doing something, and that we're seen to be doing something that's meaningful as well, not just coming up with some greenwashing that ticks a box, actually something that's going to make a difference. And that's where I think that's where our competitive advantage and the competitive edge really sits, because actually if we can evidence and show that actually not only are we doing these things, but we're doing them because we care, because we mean it, and this is what we want to do. Yeah, I think that's definitely absolutely a positive for us, and it's certainly something that I think our customers appreciate. One thing I would say is I don't think, as a wider industry, I don't think we shout about it enough. I don't think we do enough on the comm side of things to show actually how beneficial for the environment we can be. Yes, there are areas where we could do more, but actually I think there's a lot that we can do to raise that profile. And again, in GTR, this is something we're starting to look at now, starting to think about how can we raise this. With regards to life cycle procurement, it's early days. There are things happening. So as part of the newest environment strategy at GTR, I've written it into the strategy around considering the life cycle of products, of projects. We have moved, my team, the environment team, have been moved out of safety and into the wider infrastructure directorate, which has been fantastically supportive, and I can't be happier. It's been brilliant. It's made such a change because the right people are in the right place to actually start influencing and making a difference. And again, as part of that, We've done some workshops with the wider infrastructure directorate on how to encourage life cycle thinking within project works within facilities management, including the guys from procurement about how can we reduce our packaging and also make sure we're procuring the right sustainable materials. It is very early days, very early days, and there is still a lot of work to do on that, but it is something we are slowly starting to build in. Andrew, I don't know, you said there was you might be able to cover this from your side of things as well, perhaps?
Yes, could I bring in Andrew at this point to talk around the question around infrastructure, life cycle management and assessment as well. Plus, we've had a few other questions. One on the situation around third rail infill, and I think we all know around the ORR's views on that and whether you might have a few words to say on that. And we've also had a question on hydrogen as well and the efficacy of hydrogen, which of course Adrian also addressed. So if you could give us a few words on that, please, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Firstly, on the life cycle aspect, we did have a fair amount of investigation of this during the work of the task force, and we need to pick up on this again going forward. One of the issues that Jason flagged up is the fact that it's actually sort of distributed in terms of ownership and management across a number of different agencies, and that causes complications. But essentially what we're looking at is when you have a major infrastructure renewal and you plan it right, you can typically get up to 10% efficiency improvement in terms of carbon life cycle. What we are trying to say is that in the future, if we're developing new large projects around depots, stations or track, that there are a number of tools out there around things like BREEAM or SQL, if you're familiar with those as sustainability assessment tools, and also the carbon assessment tools, PAS 2080 and other ones like that, where they have been advisory in the past, but they haven't been mandated. And we're suggesting that they should be mandated, not only in terms of design, but also in use. There is a tool available which is managed by RSSB called the Rail Carbon Tool, and with that you can actually do a carbon assessment of certain types of infrastructure project based on their life cycle impacts of the components. So there are ways and means of doing that. If you want to find out about the Rail Carbon Tool in more detail, do by all means contact me separate to this, and I can put you in contact with the people in RSSB who are leading on that. Second point on that is around the third rail and infill. There is a project, I flagged this one up in the presentation I gave, 1214, which will be starting up this year to look at the role of the third rail within a low carbon network. One of the issues it will be looking at is whether or not it's sensible to do infill on that third carbon rail network, so that you can get continuous electrification on key routes. And it's going to be looking at a carbon assessment and also an economic assessment as to what the options are for doing that. And indeed, my understanding is, I think the specification is still being developed. There may be a question asked about third rail as a long-term component with an electrified network. Third point here is that with hydrogen, it does have very specific capabilities. If you don't have access to the electrified network, it does have the ability to deliver a train with significant range and working at a reasonable speed. There is work which Joe flagged up around whether or not you can make it work on the freight network in areas where, again, you don't have access to the electrified network and you're trying to remove thermal combustion from the mix. Adrian pointed out that in energy terms, the production of hydrogen for use on the railway is much less efficient than using battery or electrification directly, but under certain circumstances where you have difficulties accessing a grid distribution system, the generation of hydrogen on a local basis from renewable resources, where that may be a cost-effective option, even though it takes quite a lot of energy, may be an effective way of delivering traction options to remoter areas, or if there is an opportunity for hydrogen generation scale from outside the rail industry where that hydrogen can be delivered on a cost-effective basis to power hydrogen trains, yes, that could also be done. Although it's acknowledged that if we are to develop hydrogen trains, the single biggest variable is actually the cost of hydrogen, which will be a direct consequence of the energy used. So I think those are the three key points I'd like to raise on those three questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Andrew. I'd like David to come back now. David, we've had some questions around is there a missed opportunity cost around not electrifying, or not electrifying more effectively now, more quickly now? If you could let us have some thoughts on that. If you could let us have some thoughts around the current procurement diesel biomodes and how does that fit into this push for decarbonisation? And a final word from you on how do we make this? How do we get started? What would you your immediate asks be to find a way forward for this?
Okay, I'll deal with the middle question first, the diesel bimode question. It would be helpful if we didn't order any more of those, I would suggest, because if we ordered one today in 2020, it might have a useful working life out to 2030. But if we start continue to order them, then that's going to threaten their economic life. Of course, there's the opportunity later in life to make them into pure electrics, but as we've ordered quite a lot of them in recent years, I would think that a projection would suggest that there's probably not much case for very many more of them. With regards to the opportunity cost, the risk we're at the moment, as I alluded to, is that teams delivering efficiently, coming off existing projects like Great Western, which we finished recently out to Cardiff, and Midland Main Line, will have nowhere to go. There'll be no follow-on projects. Yet we know that it's quite like, you know, it's almost certain there will need to be substantial amounts of additional electrification going forward in order for us to deliver the objective of net zero carbon, never mind just to run an efficient railway. And so the lost opportunity is losing those people and then having to bring them back again. So I think there's certainly what RIA is campaigning for is to make sure that that doesn't happen, but also to bring forward some shovel-ready schemes, not just to keep those people busy, but for us to ramp up to the kind of level that we might need to deliver. And you know, that graph that I showed was based upon us needing to do 450 kilometers a year out to 2050, which is pretty much as much as we've ever done in the past. So we're getting up to a level of activity similar to CP5 or similar to East Coast. That doesn't happen overnight. We need to start the designs now. We need to start ramping up the skills and capability to do that. And so in a rebalancing the economy environment or a recovery from COVID-19 environment, if the government wants to keep people busy, then we'll certainly be pushing that forward as a suggestion to keep people busy and create high value productive employment and decarbonize the railways. On the low carbon rolling stock, you know, my view is that there's plenty of options out there. Adrian has talked about what his company offer. There are a number of other players in the marketplace. They're all credible offers. There is no reason in my mind to wait. And again, another way to stimulate the UK economy would be for government to encourage train operators to be going out and making some fleet orders. And then we really gain the operational experience that we need to really get the best out of those new units. Okay, back to you, Alex.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, David. And I'm sure those are things we can all get behind very, very quickly. So thank you. And the last word will go to Adrian. So Adrian, we've had a question in from Noel on the DFT strategy, Transport Decarbonisation Strategy, a Network Rail undertaking a network traction decarbonisation study. How will these two documents, in your mind, how will these two documents fit together? And one final point, if I may ask you for that, is what are your views on how do we make tangible progress on rail decarbonisation?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. I think David's last point about government encouraging train operators by whatever means to start to dip their toe in the water to produce some battery trains ordered from whoever, hopefully my company, but equally others are doing it as well. I think that's right, because with anything new, my experience, and I have introduced a few new things over the years, is that you actually have to have a demonstration to people that what works in theory does actually work in practice. So I think that's important. Now, the government policy documents, we and lots of other people have made contributions to those documents when there's been consultation, and we would hope that, as I think several people have said, there's definitely a move during this COVID-19 period, especially when people have noticed pollution going down for obvious reasons, to actually get even more enthusiastic about having a green transport system. And my own expectation is that the year 2040, which is current target as has been described, that will not be the current target in 5 years' time, because actually I think it's a very unambitious one. As I've demonstrated, we actually have products which are on sale now, are talking to quite a lot of people about converting trains as well. And I'll just finish up, if I may, Alex, on a small point. With the 25 kV train that I spoke about, we have identified more than 60 routes in this country where that train or ones very similar could replace DMUs. And I can see a case where long before 2030, all of the medium and lower speed DMUs could have been replaced, some converted, some replaced, leaving the higher speed routes, which in my view, always has been my view, they should be electrified. And I totally support what David and Ria are saying on that.
Thank you very much, Adrian. And that's a fantastic way to round off the conversation, and one I think we can all fully support. So if I could thank all of our speakers again. We had Andrew, Joe, Jason, David and Adrian. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to Rebecca at the Waterfront Conference Company who's put this together, and thank you to Freshwater for sponsoring this webinar. And thank you very much to everyone who's listened in, who's watched this, who's asked questions. It's a hugely important topic. We know it's a top priority for government, and it's one that I look forward to revisiting on the 10th of September, when hopefully we can all meet in person and discuss this subject further and see how things are progressing, given the current COVID pandemic and how that's impacting on people's thoughts, lives in that regard. So stay well, stay safe, everyone. It's good to see you, and hopefully see you all again very soon. Thank you very much.